kingdom can survive defeat, but it rarely survives victory. When Burgundy collapsed, Europe expected celebration. What followed instead was fear. Because when the strongest rival disappears, one question echoes through every court and castle: who is next? France stood at a crossroads. The war was over, yet the danger had only changed its shape. Louis XI had won without a final battle, without a heroic charge, without a crowned enemy kneeling before him. And that made his triumph deeply unsettling. There were no songs written for this victory, no knights returning in glory, only nobles watching the king in silence, wondering when his gaze would fall on them. Burgundy was gone, but feudal power still breathed. Dukes, counts, and princes remained embedded across France like old roots beneath the soil. They obeyed the crown in public and resisted it in private. Each believed their privilege was untouchable. Each believed the king needed them. Louis XI understood the truth they refused to see. A kingdom held together by tradition alone is already broken. He did not inherit a united France. He inherited a puzzle of rival houses, private armies, and ancient rights that weakened the crown at every turn. And he knew that open force would only harden resistance. So Louis chose a different path. He treated France not as land to be conquered, but as a web to be rewoven. Every noble became a thread, every alliance a knot that could be loosened. Where others ruled through spectacle, Louis ruled through absence. He stayed out of tournaments. He avoided grand ceremonies. He listened more than he spoke. Behind closed doors, letters moved faster than armies. Gold replaced banners. Promises replaced threats. This was not peace. It was preparation. The fall of Burgundy was only the beginning. Now the Spider King turned inward, toward his own kingdom, and what he planned would change France forever. If you want to understand how Louis XI dismantled feudal power and rebuilt France from the inside, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey into the most dangerous form of power in history. Louis XI did not declare war on his own nobles. That was the brilliance of it. There were no banners raised against the crown, no dramatic calls to arms, no battlefield where loyalty could be proven in steel. Instead, there was silence, letters sealed in wax, messengers traveling at night, agreements written softly and enforced quietly. Louis understood something his rivals did not. A noble who fights openly becomes a martyr. A noble who is isolated becomes a problem that solves itself. When unrest stirred in one province, the king did not rush troops toward it. He sent envoys to the neighboring lord, not with threats, but with opportunity. A trade privilege here, a marriage alliance there, tax exemptions, access to royal favor. The message was always the same: remain loyal and prosper. Stand with your neighbor and lose everything. Rebellion under Louis XI was never met head-on. It was surrounded, starved of allies, stripped of momentum before it could breathe. A noble who considered revolt would look to his peers for support. What he found instead was hesitation, silence, closed gates. Because each man knew the same truth. If he stood beside the rebel today, his rival might be rewarded tomorrow. Louis XI turned distrust into a weapon. He made loyalty profitable and unity dangerous. Marriage became a battlefield. A single union could shift balance in an entire region. A daughter married into one house meant exclusion for another. Grievances multiplied quietly. Trade routes became levers of control. Cities loyal to the crown received privileges. Markets flourished where obedience lived. Borders hardened around those who resisted. Soon rebellion did not spread. It stalled. Nobles stopped asking who would lead the uprising. They began asking who would betray it first. This was a war without declarations, a conflict measured not in casualties, but in fractures. Every failed conspiracy left the nobility weaker. Every suppressed revolt strengthened the crown without bloodshed. Louis XI never needed to crush the aristocracy in one blow. He dismantled it piece by piece. By the time some lords realized what was happening, it was already too late. Their armies were intact, but their influence was gone. Their titles remained, but their independence had vanished. France was still covered in castles, still ruled by nobles, but they no longer moved as one body. They had been separated, pacified, neutralized. The Spider King had no need to strike. The web was already tight. The great noble rebellions did not collapse in fire. They collapsed in suspicion. On paper, the aristocracy still looked formidable. Old families, ancient banners, centuries of inherited authority. But authority depends on belief, and Louis XI understood how fragile belief could be. When nobles gathered in secret councils, they spoke of honor and shared grievance. Yet beneath every oath lived a quiet fear. Who among us is already speaking to the king? Louis never rushed to expose conspiracies. He allowed them to breathe just long enough to rot. A noble would discover that a promised ally had delayed his troops. Another would learn that royal favor had been granted to a supposed partner. Letters appeared at the wrong moment. Rumors traveled faster than armies. No one knew where the truth ended and manipulation began. Rebellion requires trust. Louis made trust impossible. One lord would abandon the cause to secure his lands. Another would hesitate to protect his heir. Each act of self-preservation weakened the whole. And when a revolt finally surfaced, it was already hollow. Few banners answered the call. Fewer still marched with conviction. Louis did not answer these uprisings with mass executions. He knew that blood creates legends, martyrs inspire memory. Instead, he isolated. A rebellious noble would find his trade privileges revoked. His neighbors suddenly enjoyed royal favor. His creditors became impatient, his vassals uncertain. Soon the question was no longer how to resist the crown. It became how to survive without it. Power that once felt sacred began to look conditional. Titles remained, but obedience now defined their value. The old idea of feudal authority was built on inevitability. A lord ruled because his father ruled, because his blood was ancient, because God had supposedly ordained it. Louis replaced inevitability with dependency. Nobles were no longer pillars of the realm. They were participants in a system they did not control. Every failed revolt sent a message, not just that rebellion was dangerous, but that rebellion was lonely. Men who once imagined themselves as equals to the king now negotiated for survival. They learned to ask permission instead of issuing commands, to wait for royal approval before acting within their own lands. Without a single decisive battle, the mystique of feudal power faded. The crown did not destroy the aristocracy. It domesticated it. Castles still stood across France. Lords still held court. But the center of gravity had shifted. Authority no longer flowed upward from the land. It flowed outward from the king. By the end of these quiet conflicts, the nobility was intact in name but transformed in nature. They ruled by tolerance, not by right. And in that transformation, something irreversible occurred. Feudal power lost its sacred weight. The idea that a noble could stand against the crown by birth alone disappeared. What replaced it was a new truth. In this France, loyalty was no longer inherited. It was managed. Rebuilding France did not begin with celebration. It began with control. After years of fragmentation, Louis XI moved to claim what kings before him had only imagined. For the first time, the authority of the state extended beyond ceremony and into daily life. Taxes were no longer negotiated endlessly with local lords. They were assessed, collected, and directed by the crown. This shift changed everything. Money stopped flowing upward through feudal favors and began moving through a central system that answered to one will. With revenue came permanence. A standing army replaced temporary levies. Soldiers were paid by the state, not bound by loyalty to a noble house. Military force was no longer personal. It became institutional. This army did not exist to glorify chivalry. It existed to enforce stability. At the same time, Louis quietly changed who the kingdom protected. Merchants received safe passage. Trade routes were guarded. Markets expanded under royal oversight. Where knights once defined power through land and violence, merchants now gained influence through contracts and credit. Commerce created predictability. Predictability weakened feudal chaos. Law followed the same logic. Customs based on lineage slowly gave way to written statutes. Courts tied to noble privilege lost authority to royal judges. Justice became something that could be appealed rather than inherited. This did not mean equality. It meant consistency. And consistency is the foundation of any state that intends to last. France began to change in how it understood itself. No longer a mosaic of territories bound loosely by allegiance. It became a single body governed from the center. Local identities survived, but sovereignty did not. Power flowed from the crown outward, not upward from the land. Louis did not erase the nobility. He reframed it. Lords remained important, but their importance depended on service, not ancestry, not tradition. What mattered now was usefulness to the state. This new model favored patience over spectacle, administration over heroism, ink over steel. It also reshaped loyalty. Subjects began to see themselves not as followers of a lord, but as members of a kingdom. Protection came from the state. Obligations were owed to the crown. This was not a revolution announced with proclamations. It unfolded quietly through paperwork, taxation, and enforcement. Yet its consequences were profound. For the first time, France functioned as a unified entity. Its borders mattered. Its laws reached across regions. Its power did not vanish when a noble rebelled or a dynasty faltered. Louis XI had not simply won political struggles. He had changed the structure that made those struggles possible. The feudal world had relied on personal bonds. This new France relied on systems. And systems outlast individuals. By the end of this reconstruction, something irreversible had taken place. France was no longer a collection of lands ruled by history. It was a state moving toward a future shaped by control, coordination, and central authority. The web was no longer just a weapon. It had become the framework of the kingdom itself. By the time the new order settled into place, the balance of power in France had fundamentally shifted. There was no longer a lord wealthy enough, independent enough, or militarily strong enough to challenge the throne. The great houses still existed, but they revolved around the king rather than confronting him. Their rivalries no longer threatened the state. They competed for access, favor, and survival within a system they could not escape. The crown had become the fixed center of gravity. For the Valois Dynasty, this moment marked an unprecedented summit. Not because of conquest or ceremony, but because authority no longer leaked away. Power stayed where it was meant to stay. The king was no longer first among equals. He was the final arbiter of law, wealth, and force. Decisions flowed downward without negotiation. Resistance became impractical rather than heroic. This was the triumph of control over tradition. France now moved as one body. Its resources were predictable, its responses calculated, its future no longer hostage to feudal impulse. From the outside, this looked like stability. From within, it felt like distance. The monarchy gained efficiency but lost intimacy. Subjects were governed, not persuaded, protected but rarely inspired. The romantic chaos of earlier centuries faded. In its place stood a colder logic. Loyalty was expected, not earned. Obedience was measured, not emotional. This transformation strengthened the Valois beyond anything their predecessors could have imagined. But it also reshaped the soul of the kingdom. France became practical, calculating, suspicious of idealism. The court rewarded competence over courage, silence over defiance. Those who understood the system thrived. Those who clung to older notions of honor found themselves irrelevant. The dynasty stood taller than ever, yet it stood alone. The same mechanisms that eliminated rivals also eliminated warmth. Power became abstract. The king was present everywhere through officials, laws, and taxes, but personally nowhere. This distance was the cost of absolute authority. For the Valois, the achievement was undeniable. They had survived internal collapse, foreign invasion, and civil war. They had bent history back in their favor. But the France they ruled was no longer the France of banners and oaths. It was a state built on discipline and fear of disorder. This version of France could endure, it could mobilize, it could dominate. Yet it would never again be innocent. The peak of Valois power was not a golden age, it was a turning point. From this height, the monarchy looked unassailable, but the structure beneath it had changed forever. Strength now depended on systems rather than loyalty, on obedience rather than belief. And systems demand constant pressure to survive. The crown had reached its highest point. What remained was the long shadow that followed such power. Louis XI was never meant to be loved. History does not remember him through songs or statues of marble and light. There are no legends of gallant charges or heroic last stands tied to his name. What remains instead is something far more permanent. When Louis died, the kingdom he left behind could not return to what it once was. The old order had been quietly dismantled piece by piece, not shattered in one dramatic moment, but loosened until it no longer held together. France did not wake up free. It woke up organized. The nobles were still alive, but they were no longer sovereign powers. The crown no longer negotiated its authority. It administered it. Louis XI ruled without inspiring devotion, yet he achieved something no charismatic warrior king had ever secured: irreversibility. After him, power could not flow backward. No coalition of lords could resurrect feudal independence. No uprising could truly restore the past. The state had replaced the kingdom. This was his true legacy, a France shaped not by honor or lineage, but by systems, loyalty, and calculation. To some, this was progress. To others, it was loss. The nation that emerged was stronger, more stable, and more predictable, but also colder, more distant, governed less by shared belief and more by necessity. Louis XI understood something few rulers before him dared to accept. That affection fades, fear passes, but structure endures. He built a monarchy that did not depend on the personality of the man wearing the crown. It functioned regardless of who sat on the throne. That is why his work survived him. Centuries later, historians would argue about his methods. They would debate his morality. They would question whether his tactics crossed invisible lines. Yet they would agree on one point: France as a modern political entity begins here. Not on a battlefield, not in a cathedral, but in rooms filled with letters, seals, accounts, and silent agreements. The Spider King never claimed glory. He claimed permanence. And that leaves us with an unsettling question that still echoes through history. Could modern France have been born without a ruler willing to stand in the shadows, to pull threads instead of swinging swords, to win without applause? Was the price of unity always secrecy, control, and distance? History does not answer this question. It only shows us the result. A kingdom transformed into a state, a crown no longer fragile, a dynasty standing at its highest point. If this story changed the way you see power, history, and kingship, subscribe to the channel. More chapters await. More shadows remain to be explored.